Okay, we're back working on the FJ40. We got the front grille removed. It was pretty easy. It consists of 3 bolts on each side. It's going into the side panels and 2 bolts on the fender diagonals on each side. Lucky for me, I only had one of the diagonal bolts holding it on, and 2 of the smaller fender bolts on each side, and the hinge that's on the front grille that mounts to the frame wasn't even connected. So it didn't take much to remove it. And I also got the front bezel removed as well as the headlights. That took some considerable amounts of PB Blaster, a battery operated driver, and some elbow grease to get all those rusted bolts out. But we've got it apart. Labeling the wire harness with some of the connections as I disassemble things. Some are fairly obvious, the headlight ones, but there are a few that are just dangling here that are unknowns that I'll have to go back and figure out. But we're working to get access to the front of the engine here. We want to try and turn it over manually to see if it'll spin. We put some oil down into the cylinders earlier by removing the spark plugs. That's in an earlier video. And so we're getting to the point where we want to try and turn it over to make sure it moves, and then slowly work towards turning it over with the starter, and then hopefully getting it to run. A lot of work ahead. We got a lot to do with regards to the emission system. I do have a new radiator now, an OEM stock radiator. I have the radiator mounting frame now that I purchased off the forums, as well as the radiator frame support rods and the various bushings that I was able to get through a online Toyota parts store. And I have a new hose kit as well as a thermostat for the thermostat housing. I also have the oil sender unit on the oil cooler, and all the hoses. So we hopefully will get this going soon. Okay, so here's the grill, front grill assembly that I removed. You can see the bottom hinge that mounts to the frame. This was left unbolted from the previous owner. Luckily, he kept the bolts with the mount. This allows the front grill assembly to fold down. And you can see on the side here a little better detail of the mounting holes. You've got 2 slots here and some fixed holes here that have corresponding slots on the fender diagonals. So it's pretty easy by loosening the bolts to be able to fold this front grill assembly down. The headlights are held into their bases only by a couple of bolts through some of the mounting features here. And there's a bezel that goes around the light as well. There's also a spring that, see if you can see it in the bag here. Yeah, there's also 2 mounting bolts and a spring that hold it onto the light pan. So you get 2 sets of those. As you can see, I'm bagging the hardware and putting little labels into the little sandwich bags as I go. I'm sure I'm going to go through a lot of these zipper bags. Any brand obviously would work here. I got these at the dollar store. But labeling what the bolts are. These bolts here are the ones that were holding the grill assembly onto the front of the truck. A number of them are missing. And this is the hardware that held the front bezel, this white piece here, to the grill. It consists of 4 rubber type standoff bushings and 4 bolts that thread into welded on nuts onto the grill assembly. So I'm holding on to all of this stuff. I'll go through it later, determine what can be reused and cleaned up and what needs to be replaced. But I want to keep all the parts together as a group and cataloged so I know where they came from. And so don't know if these headlights are any good. I'll probably hook them up to a power supply later. And the little light mounting plates are still soaking with PB Blaster to try and loosen those screws up. Here is where the spring that I assume provides some spring tension, and so when you align the lights, it pulls it against the two mounting screws to help you aim the headlights and adjust those. That gets mounted on these clips here. So we'll document that for reference so when we go to put it all back together. But it needs some work. The paint is in okay condition. I'm trying to decide whether to leave it with the natural patina or go ahead and have it all sandblasted down to bare metal. I'm sure I'll be debating that for a while. There's some schools of thought that say, you know, get it running and drive it for a while and do the full restoration later. But there are some things that need attention. But that's the front grille assembly and the lights. And we will continue on. Okay, so work continues today. This is the next morning. It's a Saturday, September the 1st, 2018. And progress continues. Last night I was able to remove the belts that go to the alternator and to the smog pump. I actually had to remove the smog pump in order to get the belt off, but we're working our way closer into the engine. Got the fan off as well so I can reach in and get down to the crank. Okay, so our next step will be to get a socket onto the nut here. I special ordered one through Napa that should fit. We'll find out shortly, and then we'll be able to turn the engine over manually. One new thing I learned last night was that this has a manual hand crank mechanism in the front. I was unaware that the 78s had a manual starting option with the old style crank lever, so that's kind of interesting. So our plan is we'll pull the plugs, we'll go ahead and see if it'll turn over manually. We may then use an impact driver or a electric drill with that socket to try and spin it over at a higher speed, then eventually work towards getting it to turn over with the starter. Then we'll pull the air cleaner assembly off, get access to the carb, and see if we can get it to kick over. We don't have coolant hooked up, so it'll have to be short duration, but I do have all the parts I need to get the radiator installed, and so we'll do that. We'll squirt some fuel into the carburetor since I don't have any lines from the tank running to the manual pump yet, and then we'll see if we can move forward. And somewhere along that way we'll get an oil change in there as well so we don't do any damage. Okay, so what we have here is a 46 millimeter socket I got at Napa on a breaker bar with an adapter to fit. And we have a nice nut here, and we'll go ahead and see if she turns. Ah, okay, there she goes. Nice. Okay, that was easier than I had expected. We had put oil down into each of the 6 cylinders a couple of weeks back and reinstalled the spark plugs and kind of let it sit. And it's turning freely at the moment, so that's nice. So that's a good sign. can even hear noise coming from the cylinders. It sounds like either the valves are actuating or maybe it's just the air being pushed as the pistons cycle. It's stiff, but it's moving. It's good. Okay, so what we're looking at here is the back end of the starter. We've spent the last 15-20 minutes turning the engine over by hand using the 46mm socket on the crank, and we put some more of the oil down into the cylinders, and it's spinning manually really well. So we're going to go ahead and try to rig up an electrical circuit to see if the starter will work. Now the starter has a direct connection from the battery to one of the lugs, one of the main lugs you see there at the top. And then there's another trigger signal we need to give it in order to energize a coil inside to close some contacts to connect the battery voltage to the actual starter motor, and then hopefully it will engage the flywheel assembly and turn the engine over, and then we'll be able to see if that part works. So I've got to get some stuff to do that, and then we'll give that a try. But that's our next step, to see if we can get this thing to turn over using the starter, and then we'll start looking at getting the ignition coil, ballast resistor, and all of that hooked up. We'll test the ignition switch circuit, make sure there aren't any shorts there, and then start looking at the distributor and the connections to the spark plugs. And then we still have yet to pull the air filter assembly and see what the carb looks like. But let's first see if we can get this thing to turn over using the starter. Okay, so after manually turning over the engine with the socket and breaker bar and getting the oil to start flowing through, because as we crank over the engine, the mechanical oil pump is going to start pumping oil through the engine. The oil has started to seep out of the oil pressure sender hole here that currently has a rag hanging out of it and starting to drip on the floor. So we are getting oil moving through the system. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this out. I've got the oil pressure sensor unit. I'm going to go ahead and screw that in so that we don't have any paths for oil to leak out before we move on to the next step. Okay, so we've gone ahead and pulled the rag that was in the oil pressure sensor mounting position and went ahead and mounted a OEM oil pressure sender unit in that hole. That takes a 14mm wrench and just threads in until it tightens out. No gasket, no sealant needed. Threaded right in with no issue, so that should stop the oil leaks. And so we'll keep an eye on that as we move forward and try and crank over the engine, but I believe we're good now. Okay, so we have our positive battery terminal cable connected to the main power plug on the starter. We also have, let me see if I can get it, an ignition switch plugged into the solenoid that will close the contacts. We made a temporary engine ground. Let's see if we can see it on the frame. Yeah, right there where we took the ground wire off the engine block, mounted it to a frame rail, mounted a temporary negative battery terminal to that to give us our circuit. Up here we have our ignition switch and positive terminal hooked up. I know it's kind of corroded and kludgy. And then we have our ground, and then we have an ignition switch that we bought at Napa this afternoon. Okay, and without further ado, we'll go ahead and see if the starter will spin the motor over. All right, I'm not sure how strong the battery is. It's been sitting here in the shop for about a month or two. It may need to be charged, but the starter engages and is strong enough to turn the engine over. Okay, so we know that the starter's good, and we know that the engine isn't seized, and now we can wire up a proper starter system and get the coil and everything else wired in. Then we'll move on to pulling the air cleaner, seeing what the carburetor looks like, and hopefully try and kick it over. There is oil in the engine, and it's about halfway between the low and high line, so we're good there. And so we'll probably do an initial start with that, or I may go ahead and change it. I don't know. I've got the oil, I've got the filters, and maybe we'll go ahead, now that we know the starter works and the engine isn't seized, go ahead and do an oil change. So we're starting with good stuff. But overall, so far we're making some good progress.